No one shed a tear when she was cast out to die in the 20-degree below zero frost. Not a mother's hand, nor a sister's word, nor a brother's glance. Just the slam of a door, a bundle with stale bread, and an old blanket tossed after her. Helen walked on, never looking back, as she always did, silently, like a shadow, because from birth she couldn't hear the shouts or curses hurled behind her. The sprawling forests of the Pacific Northwest embraced her with cold indifference. Deaf means tainted, her father used to say when her mother was alive. So much effort wasted on her, and for what? Can't hear, can't speak, just waves her hands around like an idiot. Who would marry such a girl? Her mother always remained silent, only holding her daughter tighter. She taught Helen sign language, showed her how to read lips. But now her mother was gone. 3 weeks ago they buried her in the village cemetery, and that same day Stephen, her father, as if freed from the last shackles of conscience, decided to get rid of his burden. "Leave," he said slowly and clearly, so his daughter could read his lips. "There's no place for you in my house any more." Helen knew that the real reason for her banishment wasn't her deafness. 3 months prior, she had committed an unforgivable sin in her father's eyes. She had become pregnant by a young trapper passing through their village. He promised to return, but vanished, just as the spring snows melted in the mountains. And with him, her hope for a family dissolved. Her father forced her to get rid of the baby. A root doctor from a neighboring village gave her a potion, and Helen nearly died along with the unborn infant. Her mother nursed her back to health, but then fell ill herself from the arduous labor and worry. And now, with her mother buried, her father had driven her out, as if punishing her for a double sin, for her deafness and for the shame of her pregnancy. She trudged along the snow-covered trail, moving further and further from her home village. Her feet sank deep into the snow, and her fingers turned numb from the cold. The meager bundle of bread and the blanket were all that remained of her former life. 18 years spent among people who never tried to truly hear her. The first night in the wilderness caught her off guard. Helen fashioned a makeshift shelter between 2 enormous pine trees, wrapping herself in the blanket. The cold seeped into her bones. She thought she wouldn't survive until morning, but her body, accustomed to harsh winters, resisted. She dozed in fits and starts, flinching at every crack of branches and howl of the wind, which she felt more than heard. By morning, the frost had intensified. Her lips were chapped, her fingers unresponsive. She moved on, not knowing where she was going, just walking to keep from freezing in place. The sun barely pierced through the heavy clouds, reflecting in the snow crystals. Helen walked until her legs gave out, and she collapsed into the snow. "This is it," she thought, watching the snowflakes drift down slowly. Around her stretched the boundless wilderness, indifferent to human suffering. The silence inside her head perfectly matched the silence of the snow-laden forest. She didn't hear the soft footsteps in the snow, but felt a presence. Turning her head, Helen saw a wolf, large, with silvery gray fur, standing a few yards away. Their gazes met, and the girl saw a strange understanding in the animal's amber eyes. The wolf was wounded. A dark trail of blood ran down its flank. Helen wasn't afraid. Death by wolf fangs seemed more merciful than slow freezing. But the wolf didn't attack. It just watched, as if assessing the human before it. Then it slowly approached and lay down beside her, warming her with its body. What happened next changed Helen's destiny forever. But she didn't yet know that salvation from death in the wilderness was just the beginning of a story that would turn her whole life upside down and give her what she never had: a family that accepted her for who she was. Before we begin, as is tradition, write in the comments where you are from, subscribe, like, and watch until the end. Here we go. The warmth of the strange body brought Helen back to life. She slowly opened her eyes, at first not understanding what was happening. The she-wolf lay beside her, pressed against her side, watching warily into the distance. The girl cautiously propped herself up on her elbow. The wound on the animal's flank looked bad, a deep gash, crusted with clotted blood. A trap or a poacher's bullet, Helen thought, remembering her father boasting about game caught by illegal means. The she-wolf turned its head and looked directly into her eyes. There was no fear or aggression in that gaze, only a deep, piercing weariness and pain. Helen slowly extended her hand. The animal didn't flinch, only watched warily. The girl gently touched the thick fur near the wound. The she-wolf trembled, but didn't bite or snarl. "I'll help you," Helen mouthed silently, knowing the animal wouldn't understand words, but might feel the intention. She scooped up a handful of snow and carefully washed the wound. The she-wolf endured, flinching only occasionally from the pain. Helen tore a strip from her already tattered shirt, bandaging the wound. All this time their eyes met, as if a silent bond was forming between them, the one who couldn't hear sounds and the one who didn't speak human language. After finishing the dressing, the girl suddenly realized how cold she was. Her fingers were numb, her lips blue. The she-wolf, as if understanding her condition, moved closer. Helen hesitantly pressed against the warm side of the animal, covering them both with her worn blanket. They lay like that until evening. Helen drifted in and out of sleep, waking up from the cold. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. She took out the last piece of bread, broke it in half, and offered a portion to the she-wolf. The animal carefully took the offering from her palm. When darkness fell, the she-wolf suddenly tensed. Its ears perked up, its head turning towards a thicket of young fir trees. Helen followed its gaze and froze in astonishment. From behind the trees emerged 3 wolf pups, lean, with fluffy tails and curious eyes. The she-wolf made a soft sound, which Helen felt more as a vibration than heard. The pups approached, sniffing warily at the human. The bravest came first, cautiously sniffing the girl's hand and licking her fingers. The others followed suit, surrounding the human and their injured mother. That night, Helen slept in a ring of wolves, warmed by 4 bodies. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. Her sleep was deep and peaceful, despite the frost and hunger. In the morning, the she-wolf was the first to rise. It carefully slipped out from under the blanket and disappeared into the forest, leaving its young with the girl. Helen watched it go with anxiety, not knowing if her unexpected savior would return. The pups huddled against her, seeking warmth. About an hour passed. The hunger became unbearable. Helen thought this day would be her last, without food, in the middle of the wilderness, many miles from the nearest human dwelling. But then the bushes rustled, and the she-wolf appeared, holding a freshly caught rabbit in its jaws. It laid the prey before the girl and stepped back, as if offering her to sate her hunger first. Helen had never eaten raw meat in her life, but now there was no choice. She took out the small knife she always carried on her belt and began to butcher the carcass, giving the best pieces to the pups and their mother. She herself ate very little, overcoming her revulsion. Once she had regained some strength, Helen decided to move on. She didn't know where she was going, but she understood that staying in one place meant certain death. To her surprise, the wolf family followed her. The she-wolf walked ahead, occasionally glancing back, as if checking that her strange new acquaintance hadn't fallen behind. The pups frolicked nearby, sometimes running ahead, sometimes returning to the girl. So passed one day, and then another. Helen followed the wolves, who seemed to know where they were going. Every night they slept together, warming each other. Every morning the she-wolf brought prey, sometimes a rabbit, sometimes a grouse, once even a young deer. The girl learned to eat raw meat, learned to identify edible roots under the snow, learned to truly see and feel the wilderness. On the 4th day of their journey, Helen noticed a strange smell in the air. Smoke. Not the sharp smoke of a forest fire, but the subtle aroma of a campfire. Somewhere ahead, there were people. Her heart beat faster. Part of her yearned for human warmth, but another part feared encountering cruelty and alienation again. The she-wolf also scented the smoke. It stopped, sniffing alertly. Its body tensed, and worry appeared in its eyes. Helen understood. Humans had always been a threat to wolves, but instead of turning back, the she-wolf continued on, though more cautiously. By evening, they had climbed a small rise, and Helen saw below, in the river valley, a native encampment. Several conical tents were arranged in a semicircle, thin wisps of smoke rising from them. Deer pens were visible around, and people in traditional fur clothing moved between the dwellings. The she-wolf stopped at the edge of the forest, hesitant to go further. Helen knelt beside it, put her arms around its neck, and pressed her face into its soft fur. It was a farewell. She understood that the wolves couldn't follow her to humans. But instead of leaving the girl, the she-wolf let out a low sound, like a howl. The echo spread through the valley. The people below froze, turning their heads in their direction. One of them, a tall man in a richly adorned hat, suddenly stopped, peering intently at the tree line. Helen felt something clench inside her. This man was looking directly at her, although in the twilight she was hardly visible. He looked as if he had been waiting for her appearance, as if he knew she would come. The she-wolf gently nudged the girl with its snout, as if to say, "Go." Helen took the first hesitant step down the slope towards the unknown. Her heart pounded like crazy. What awaited her among these strangers? Would they accept a deaf girl who came from the forest accompanied by wolves? Or would they drive her away, as her own father had done? She didn't know the answers, but something told her this path was destined. Helen looked back one last time. The she-wolf stood at the edge of the forest, majestic and proud. Their gazes met in a silent farewell. Helen knew, whatever happened next, this encounter in the wilderness had changed her life forever. And below, by the largest tent, the tall man took the first step towards her, as if recognizing in the fragile figure on the slope someone long lost and eagerly awaited. Helen descended the slope slowly, each step a struggle. Her feet sank into the deep snow, and her heart tightened with anxiety. The people below stood frozen, watching her approach. Dogs barked furiously. Deer in the pens moved restlessly. Out of the corner of her eye, the girl saw that the she-wolf and her cubs were still at the edge of the forest, ready to disappear into the thicket at any moment. A tall man in a beaded cap walked to meet her. Over his shoulders was a traditional caribou hide cloak with rich embroidery. His face, etched with wrinkles, seemed carved from stone. His cheekbones stood out in sharp relief. His eyes, as black as coals, gazed piercingly. The man was not young, around 50, but moved with the ease and strength of a hunter. Helen stopped a few steps from him. They looked at each other, and it seemed to her that time stood still. The elder raised his hand in a greeting gesture, then slowly and distinctly spoke. "I have been waiting for you." His lips moved slowly, as if he knew of her deafness and made an effort so she could read his lips. Helen flinched. How could he know of her coming? She wanted to ask, but weariness and hunger took their toll. Her knees buckled, and the girl collapsed into the snow. The man was instantly by her side, catching her arms. He shouted something to the others, and 2 women hurried over. Helen felt herself being carried towards the encampment, but her consciousness was slipping away, the image before her eyes blurring. She awoke in warmth. The first thing she saw was the low ceiling of a tent, from which came the sharp smell of smoke, wood, and cured hides. Helen lay on soft caribou skins covered by a fur blanket. Beside her sat a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and braided hair. Seeing that the girl had woken up, she smiled and offered her a wooden bowl with a hot broth. Helen sat up and gratefully accepted the drink. The liquid smelled of herbs and meat, and despite its strange taste, the girl eagerly drank it all. The woman nodded with approval and left the tent. Soon she returned, followed by the same tall man who had met Helen. Now, by the light of the hearth, she could see him better. Amulets of bone and stones hung around his neck, and a shaman's drum hung from his belt. Helen understood. This was not just an elder of the encampment, but a shaman, an intermediary between the world of humans and spirits. The shaman sat opposite her on the other side of the hearth. For a few minutes he just looked at the girl as if seeing through her, then spoke, slowly, articulating clearly, "My name is Damir. I am the shaman of this encampment. I knew you would come." Helen distractedly touched her ear, indicating she couldn't hear. Damir nodded. "I know you don't hear, but you see what others miss. The spirit sent me a dream about a girl walking with wolves." He spoke simply, without unnecessary words, but with such conviction that it was impossible to doubt his sincerity. Helen cautiously formed her fingers into a question gesture, pointing to herself and then to the tent, asking if she could stay. Damir smiled, for the first time since their meeting, and nodded. "This is your home now, if you wish." At that moment, the tent flap opened, and a young woman entered. Several other people appeared behind her, men and women with wary faces. They looked at Helen with ill-concealed fear and suspicion. "You brought a stranger into the encampment," the young woman said, addressing the shaman. "This girl cannot be the one your vision spoke of. She is a white woman and a cripple besides." Helen did not hear the words, but the woman's expression left no doubt. She was not welcome here. She suddenly felt unbearably ashamed of her appearance, dirty, in torn clothes, with disheveled hair. Instinctively, she cringed, bracing for rejection. Damir rose to his full height, his eyes flashing. "You saw the wolves, Sahina?" "They came with her and remained at the edge of the forest. Spirits do not choose by our measures. She stays." No one dared argue with the shaman, but Helen saw how the people exchanged glances, how the women pursed their lips. She was an outsider again, an outcast, not because of her deafness, but because of the very fact of her existence. The people gradually dispersed, and Helen was left alone with the shaman. Demir threw dry branches onto the fire, and the flames flared brighter. He took a handful of herbs from a pouch on his belt and cast them into the fire. A pungent smell filled the tent. "You have come at a difficult time," the shaman said, looking into the fire. "Our encampment has faced hardship. Our caribou numbers are dwindling, and sickness and hunger plague us. The spirits speak of great danger ahead." He fell silent, lost in thought. Helen didn't know how to react. She didn't understand what this strange man expected of her, why he allowed her to stay, why he spoke of visions. Suddenly, turmoil erupted outside. Demir sprang up and rushed out of the tent. Helen, overcoming her weakness, followed him. What she saw made her heart stop. The she-wolf stood at the edge of the encampment. Several men with spears and bows surrounded it, ready to attack. The pups cowered next to their mother, whimpering in fear. Demir shouted something, and the hunters stopped, but did not lower their weapons. Helen, without thinking, rushed forward. She stood between the she-wolf and the hunters, spreading her arms in a protective gesture. The men froze in confusion. The she-wolf quietly approached the girl and pressed against her legs. The pups followed their mother, trustingly nudging Helen's hands with their noses. A surprised whisper swept through the encampment. People looked at the girl and the wolves with superstitious fear. Someone whispered the word Inkamacha. This is what the tribe called shape-shifting spirits. Demir approached Helen and placed a hand on her shoulder. He didn't look surprised, rather satisfied, as if what he saw confirmed his suspicions. "Now they see," he said, gesturing to his tribesmen. "You are the one who was meant to come." Night fell. Helen was placed in a small tent at the edge of the encampment, not with the others but apart, as if separating her from the community. They brought her clean clothes, food, and water for washing. The wolves were allowed to remain nearby, but only outside, at a distance from the caribou enclosures. Lying on soft skins, Helen examined the caribou fur hat, the beaded jacket, the fur boots, everything the native people had given her. The clothing was women's, but too large, as if it had belonged to someone no longer in the encampment. Through a slit in the tent flap, she saw the starry sky and the silhouettes of the wolves guarding her sleep. Helen didn't know what tomorrow held. The shaman had accepted her, but the others, she sensed their fear and dislike. She would have to prove that she was worthy of staying among them, but for the first time in many days, Helen fell asleep without fearing death. She had a chance to start a new life, and even if this life was among strangers, with their incomprehensible customs and beliefs, it was better than a lonely death in the wilderness. Outside the tent, curled up with its tail tucked in, the she-wolf slept. Its wound had almost healed. The pups huddled nearby, and above the encampment, the northern lights glowed, playing in green and purple flashes, as if the spirits of the wilderness blessed the strange alliance of human and wolf. The first rays of sun pierced through the cracks of the tent, waking Helen. She stretched slowly, still not quite believing she was in warmth and safety. Her body ached with fatigue, but for the first time in a long while she felt rested. The girl sat on the skins, examining her new dwelling in the daylight. The tent was small but sturdy. The conical poles supporting the caribou hide covering met at the top, leaving an opening for smoke. Inside stood a small iron stove, a modern convenience, atypical for traditional dwellings. Along the walls were neatly stacked chests of birch bark and wood, and on a low table lay crafting supplies, needles, threads made of caribou sinew, pieces of fur. Helen touched the clothes given to her the day before. The jacket was intricately beaded, each pattern having its own meaning, which she didn't understand. Along the edges ran red and blue stripes, symbolizing, she guessed, the path of a person between worlds. Pushing aside the tent flap, the girl peered outside. The she-wolf and its pups lay nearby, watching the passing people warily. No one approached them, preferring to give them a wide berth. The encampment was already awake and living its usual life. Women built fires, men gathered for a hunt, children helped with chores. Helen noticed how people cast wary glances her way, whispering, pointing at her tent and at the wolves. Suddenly, yesterday's young woman, who had objected to her presence, appeared before her. Sahina, the shaman had called her. She held a wooden bowl with steaming food. Her face expressed obvious displeasure, but it seemed Demir had ordered her to feed the guest. Sahina placed the bowl on the snow in front of the tent and took a step back, as if afraid to come closer. She said something, sharply, abruptly, and although Helen didn't hear the words, the meaning was obvious. Eat and don't dare to approach our children. Helen nodded in gratitude and took the bowl. Inside was a caribou stew with wild onions and roots. The girl began to eat, feeling her strength return with each spoonful. After finishing her meal, she decided to look around. The encampment consisted of 8 tents, arranged in a semicircle around a central clearing. On the eastern side stood 2 log sheds for storing provisions and tools. Beyond the encampment were caribou pens, the main wealth of the people. Helen noticed there were few caribou, only about 20 head. For an encampment of this size, it was too few. She remembered the shaman's words about the misfortune that had befallen his people. Apparently, the herd was indeed dwindling. The girl returned to the tent and put on the gifted clothes. The tribal jacket was warm and comfortable, though a bit large. The she-wolf stood up and stretched when Helen came out again. She stroked the animal's head, feeling the coarse fur under her fingers. The pups immediately surrounded her, demanding attention. Suddenly, a loud cry broke out. Helen turned and saw a woman in horror, shielding her child. A boy about 5 years old struggled in his mother's arms, looking curiously at the wolf pups. A man, the child's father, ran up and said something sharply, looking at Helen. His hands made a gesture of pushing away. The girl flinched. She understood their fear. Wild wolves near children, that was a danger not to be ignored. But her wolves threatened no one. They were wary rather than aggressive. She gently pushed the pups away and gestured for them to stay by the tent. Surprisingly, the animals obeyed, settling down beside the she-wolf. Helen then slowly walked to the center of the encampment, wanting to show that she posed no threat. People parted before her, not wishing to approach. The girl walked, head bowed, feeling their gazes upon her. So she reached the large tent in the center of the encampment, the dwelling of the shaman, Demir. The tent flap opened, and the shaman stepped out. He smiled upon seeing Helen and raised a hand in greeting. Demir was dressed in a ceremonial costume embroidered with symbols and amulets. On his head sat a wolverine fur hat. a sign of his status. "You came at the right time," he said clearly so the girl could read his lips. "We are preparing for a ritual to honor the spirits." He pointed to the central clearing where wood was already being stacked for a large bonfire. Women prepared special offerings, dough figures, small birch bark boxes with gifts. Helen questioned, gesturing at herself. Should she participate? Demir nodded. "Everyone must be present, especially you. I have had a dream about you again and again every night for the past month." He paused, looking somewhere over her head as if seeing something only accessible to his gaze. Then he unexpectedly asked, "Where do you come from? Who are your parents?" Helen lowered her eyes. She couldn't tell her story. She couldn't speak, and the sign language her mother taught her would likely not be understood by the tribal people. But the shaman seemed to read her thoughts. He offered her a piece of birch bark and a sharpened stick stained with soot. The girl hesitantly took what was offered. She could write. Her mother had taught her the English alphabet, but she didn't know if the shaman would understand. Still, she wrote, "Helen, from Lake Village. Father drove me out." Demir examined the letters carefully, then nodded. He knew English. Many of the native people, especially the older generation, spoke 2 languages. "Helen," he repeated, tasting the name. "Why did your father drive you out?" She hesitated, then added, "Deaf, pregnant, lost baby." The shaman looked at the writing for a long time, his face unreadable. Finally, he nodded, as if having decided something for himself. "I knew a woman like you," he said, "long ago, in another life. She too heard silence, but saw what was hidden from others." He didn't explain who this woman was, and Helen didn't ask. Instead, the shaman extended his hand to her. "Come, you must take part in the ritual." The girl hesitantly placed her palm in his. Together, they walked to the central clearing where the people had gathered. Helen physically felt everyone around grow tense as she appeared next to the shaman. The ritual began with the lighting of the bonfire. Demir stood facing the flames, his hands moving in a complex ritual dance. His lips moved, uttering words Helen couldn't hear, but she felt their vibration in the air. She stood slightly apart, observing. Suddenly, the girl noticed a small boy, the same one who had been interested in the wolf pups. He was next to her, looking up with childish curiosity. Helen smiled at him. The boy unexpectedly smiled back and offered her a small wooden figure, a crudely carved wolf. At that moment, the child's mother noticed their interaction. The woman cried out, rushing to her son, pulling him away from Helen. Her face was distorted with superstitious terror. She spoke quickly, pointing at the girl and making protective gestures, a mix of pagan and Christian signs. The ritual was interrupted. All eyes turned to the scene. Shaman Demir frowned and said something sharply to the woman. She lowered her head, but defiance gleamed in her eyes. Helen felt terrible. Everything was repeating itself. Banishment, fear, rejection. She was already ready to retreat to her tent, to not be in the way, when she felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. It was an elderly native man, one of the elders. His face, etched with wrinkles, was stern but not hostile. He looked at her as if evaluating something only visible to him. Then he nodded at some internal thought and gestured for Helen to return to the fire. The ritual continued. People, one by one, cast their offerings into the fire, uttering prayers. When it was Helen's turn, she was at a loss. She had no offering. But the shaman handed her a small deerskin pouch. The girl looked inside and found a lock of her own hair, cut while she slept, and a clump of the she-wolf's fur. She understood. The shaman had prepared the offering for her. Helen threw the pouch into the fire as the others had done. The flames flared brighter for a moment, and it seemed to her that a face flickered in its flashes, not human, not animal, but something in between. The people gasped. Someone whispered the word Helen had heard yesterday, Inkamaka. Now she understood that it meant not just a shape-shifting spirit, but a person with an animal soul, or an animal with a human soul, a being between worlds. Demir approached her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Approval was in his eyes. The others looked on with a mix of fear and curiosity. But no one turned away from her any more. It was the first step towards acceptance. If this story resonates with you, please like and comment. This helps the channel grow and share more stories like this. A week passed since Helen arrived at the encampment. Gradually, life found its rhythm. In the mornings, the girl helped the women with household chores, gathering firewood, clearing snow, learning to process hides. Her movements were clumsy. The tribal women had mastered these skills since childhood, and she had to learn everything anew. They didn't rush her, but they didn't help either, watching with a mix of curiosity and wariness. In the evenings, Helen sat by her tent, observing the life of the encampment. The she-wolf and its pups were always nearby, not straying far. This caused constant discomfort among the residents. The caribou were nervous, sensing the predator's scent. Children were afraid to approach. But the shaman's word was law, and no one dared to drive away either the girl or her strange companions. One morning, the encampment was awakened by loud weeping. Helen peered out of her tent and saw a woman running desperately between the dwellings. It was Ercole, mother of 3 children. Helen recognized her, the only one who had smiled at her when others turned away. The girl rushed outside. Ercole, seeing her, froze for a moment, then lunged at her, grabbing her hands and speaking rapidly. Helen couldn't understand the words, but saw the despair in the woman's eyes. Demir approached, and Ercole turned to him, continuing to speak. The shaman listened, his frown deepening. Finally, he turned to Helen and, slowly so she could read his lips, said, "Her youngest son, Duran, is sick. High fever, unconscious. She's asking for help from all spirits, even those she fears." Helen understood. Ercole was asking her for help. But how could she, a deaf girl with no knowledge or experience, help a sick child? Demir, as if reading her thoughts, added, "You came with wolves. The spirits of the wilderness favor you. Sometimes that's more important than herbs and incantations." He took the girl's hand and led her to Ercole's tent. Inside, it was hot from the glowing stove. On the skins lay a boy about 5 years old, his face flushed, his breathing rapid and shallow. Beside him sat his father, his face set in a grim mask, but fear was evident in his eyes. Helen knelt beside the child. She didn't know what to do, but her hands seemed to reach out on their own to the boy's feverish forehead. Duran flinched at the touch but didn't open his eyes. "The fever hasn't broken for 3 days," Demir said. "Our herbs aren't helping. It's a 4-day journey by dog sled to the hospital." Helen understood. The child might not survive until medical help arrived. She looked around, seeking support, and saw the she-wolf in the tent opening. The animal looked inside, hesitant to enter. Suddenly, an idea struck Helen. She stood up and went outside to the she-wolf, whispering silently. Then she returned to the tent and gestured for them to clear a space by the stove. Ercole and her husband exchanged glances, but obeyed. Helen spread fresh skins and signaled for the child to be laid there. Once Duran was moved, the girl went outside and called the she-wolf. To everyone's astonishment, it obediently followed her into the tent. Helen pointed the animal to a spot next to the sick boy. The she-wolf sniffed, then cautiously lay down, pressing its warm side against the child. Ercole stepped forward in horror, but Demir stopped her with a gesture. His eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't intervene, merely observing. Helen covered the boy and the she-wolf with a thin skin rug, leaving only their heads exposed. Then she sat beside them and placed her hand on the child's forehead. Her fingers moved in soft, circular motions, massaging his temples and forehead as if drawing out the heat. So passed the day. The she-wolf lay still, warming the child with its body. Helen changed compresses of snow on the boy's head, pouring herbal broth brought by the shaman into his mouth. By evening, the fever had subsided a little, and his breathing became more even. Night fell. Ercole and her husband did not leave their son's side. Demir left, but promised to return in the morning. Helen remained, continuing her strange treatment. She didn't understand why she was doing it this way, but something inside told her it was right. The warmth of a living creature accustomed to the harsh wilderness was transferred to the sick boy, strengthening his own forces. By morning, what many in the encampment called a miracle occurred. Duran opened his eyes and weakly smiled. The fever had receded, his breathing normalized. He was weak, but the danger had passed. Ercole wept, embracing her child. Her husband stood nearby, his stern face softened. He looked at Helen and for the first time smiled genuinely, nodding in deep gratitude. News spread through the encampment faster than the wind. People gathered at the tent, whispering and pointing at Helen and the she-wolf as they emerged. But now in their eyes there was not fear, but respect, mixed with superstitious awe. Demir stood aside, watching. When Helen approached him, he said, "You used ancient knowledge that many have forgotten. We are so afraid of wild animals that we forget. They are part of the great circle of life, of which we are also a part." Helen didn't answer. She couldn't, but understanding shone in her eyes. She hadn't done anything supernatural. She had simply remembered how the she-wolf had warmed her in the wilderness, saving her from death. It was the first day the encampment residents began to see her not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as someone who could bring good. The first day when the word Inkamacha sounded not with fear, but with reverence. But Helen didn't know that the trial was only beginning, and that the true danger still awaited them all. After Duran's recovery, attitudes toward Helen in the encampment changed. Women no longer turned away at her approach, men nodded in greeting. Children, overcoming their fear, began to come closer, fascinated by the wolf pups, who grew larger and stronger each day. Helen herself gradually settled into her new life. She learned to butcher meat in the tribal way, to maintain the fire in the stove, to process animal hides. But most importantly, for the first time since being cast out of her home, she felt needed. One evening, a week after Duran's recovery, Demir invited her to his tent. The shaman sat by the hearth, sorting through amulets and herbs. As the girl appeared, he looked up and gestured to the spot opposite him. The fire cast whimsical shadows on the tent walls. Animal skins hung along the walls, swayed with the air currents, creating the illusion of living beasts. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling, emitting a pungent aroma. Demir watched Helen for a long time across the campfire flames, as if studying her face. Then he began to speak, slowly, so she could read his lips. "I must tell you about the vision that has come to me every night for the past month." He threw a handful of herbs into the fire. The flame flared with a greenish light, spreading a heady scent. "I saw a woman walking in the snow. Wolves followed her, not as hunters seeking prey, but as companions, as family. She was coming to our encampment, bringing change with her. I did not know if it was good or bad, but I knew it was destiny." Helen listened, her gaze fixed on his lips. The shaman's story seemed strange to her, like a fairy tale, but she was no longer surprised by anything in this place, where ancient beliefs intertwined with everyday life. "When you appeared on the slope with the she-wolf, I understood that the spirits had not deceived me, but the vision was incomplete. I saw danger looming over the encampment, and you, standing between us and that threat." Demir fell silent, looking into the fire. His face became thoughtful, almost sad. Then he looked up and said, "You have lived through banishment and loss. I know what that is like, too." These words surprised Helen. The shaman, respected by the entire community, seemed the embodiment of strength and confidence. How could he know what rejection felt like? As if answering her unasked question, Demir continued, "I wasn't always a shaman. Once I was an ordinary hunter. I had a wife, Altana, and a daughter, Sina." He faltered, as if each word was difficult to utter. "Sina was born special. She couldn't hear like you. In our tribe, such children were considered marked by spirits, for good or ill depending on the interpretation. But my wife, she saw it as a curse." Helen tensed. The story was beginning to sound too familiar. When Sina was 7 years old, tragedy struck. Altana took her to the river to wash clothes. The ice cracked. My wife saved herself, but my daughter— Demir's voice quivered. "My daughter went under the ice. Her body was found only in the spring, when the river thawed." The shaman fell silent, gazing into the fire with unseeing eyes. Helen felt a lump rise in her throat. She understood the pain of losing a child. She had experienced it herself, albeit differently. "Altana couldn't live with the guilt. She went into the wilderness and never returned. I searched for her, but found only tracks. They led to a wolf den." He picked up a wooden box nearby and opened it. Inside lay a small copper bell, the kind people tied to children's clothing to always hear where they were. "This belonged to Sina? I found it there near the den. From then on, I began to have dreams. The spirit spoke to me. That's how I became a shaman." Demir extended the bell to Helen. She carefully took it, feeling the cold metal in her palm. The bell must have jingled, but she couldn't hear the sound. 20 years passed. I thought the past was behind me, but when the visions of a woman with wolves began, I understood. The circle was closing. The shaman looked up at Helen. "I don't know who you truly are, a messenger of the spirits, or just an unfortunate girl who was lucky enough to meet a she-wolf. But I know for certain your presence here is no accident." Helen returned the bell. She didn't know what to say. The whole story seemed strange, mystical to her, but she saw the sincerity in Demir's eyes, his pain, which he couldn't hide behind the mask of a shaman. "The encampment is in danger," he continued after a pause. The caribou are dying from a strange illness. Hunting is becoming less successful. The elders say it's the wrath of the spirits. The young blame climate change and poachers. The truth is somewhere in the middle. But I feel something terrible is about to happen, and you will be at the center of these events. A commotion was heard outside the tent flap. Demir looked up, listening. Helen saw his face change from focused to alarmed. He quickly got up and went outside. The girl followed him. Outside, people had gathered. They surrounded a hunter who had just returned from the wilderness. The man was pale, his clothes torn. He spoke quickly, agitatedly, pointing towards distant hills. Demir listened, his face growing grimmer. Finishing his story, the hunter handed something small to the shaman. Helen couldn't make out what it was, but she saw how the shaman's shoulders tensed. Demir turned to her and said, articulating clearly, 3 more caribou found dead, not killed by predators, by people. And that's not all. He opened his palm, revealing what the hunter had given him. In his hand lay a shell casing from a modern, powerful cartridge used by poachers. They are close, and they're not just hunting. They're marking territory, our territory. Alarm was in his eyes, but there was something else, too. The determination of a man ready to defend his tribe to the last. The wilderness around the encampment, which had seemed so calm, suddenly became hostile, harboring a new threat. Helen looked at the hills, hidden in the evening twilight. Somewhere there, beyond the trees, crept people for whom the lives of the natives, their traditions and beliefs, meant nothing. People like those who had rejected her. And she understood that Demir's story wasn't just a tale of the past. It was a warning about the future in which she was destined to play her part. The morning was unsettling. The men of the encampment gathered near Demir's tent, discussing a plan of action against the poachers. The women stayed closer to their dwellings, not letting the children stray far. Tension hung in the air like before a storm. Helen sat by her tent, observing. The she-wolf lay beside her, its massive head resting on its paws. The pups, now nearly grown, walked restlessly around, sensing the collective mood of the encampment. Ursula approached Helen with a bowl of hot stew. Since the girl had helped Duran, the woman treated her with special warmth. "The hunters are going out on patrol," she said, knowing Helen would read her lips. "Too many strangers' tracks in recent days." The girl nodded, accepting the food. She, too, had noticed signs of alarm. Unusual bird behavior, the she-wolf's wariness, the restlessness of the caribou in the pens. Something was approaching, and this something was connected not to spirits, but to people. After breakfast, Helen decided to help with chores around the encampment. She went to the pens where women were collecting hair from shedding caribou. The work required patience and caution. The caribou were nervous at any sudden movement. Engrossed in her work, Helen didn't immediately notice the commotion. Only when all the women suddenly dropped their tasks and ran to the center of the encampment did she realize something had happened. The she-wolf, dozing nearby, raised its head, sniffing. In the center of the encampment stood Aldara, the mother of 5-year-old Beta, shouting something and waving her arms. Her face was distorted with terror. Aldara's husband, one of the best hunters in the encampment, tried to calm her, but the woman pushed him away, pointing towards the forest. Helen approached. Demir, having come out of his tent, was questioning everyone gathered. From their tense faces, it was clear. Tragedy had struck. Ercole, noticing Helen's bewilderment, came up to her and explained with gestures. Little Bator was missing. He was playing at the edge of the encampment, and when his mother turned away, he vanished. Tracks led into the wilderness. The men quickly organized search parties. They took rifles, spears, lanterns. Demir gave instructions, dividing the search area. Time was working against them. A January day is short, and a child wouldn't survive a night in the wilderness. Helen looked at the desperate mother and suddenly felt a strange unease. Her intuition, sharpened by years of living in silence, relying more on other senses, whispered they needed to act differently. She approached Demir and touched his arm, getting his attention. The shaman turned. Helen pointed to herself, then to the forest, then made a gesture depicting a wolf. Demir frowned, but understood. "You want to search for the child with the wolves?" The girl nodded. The she-wolf came closer, as if understanding the conversation. Demir shifted his gaze from her to Helen, then to the sobbing Aldara. "Can your wolves track the boy by scent?" he asked. Helen shrugged uncertainly. She didn't know, but she felt this was the best chance. Wolves could see, hear, and feel what was inaccessible to humans. Demir hesitated. Entrusting the search for a child to a wild animal was risky, but time was running out, and with it, the chances of finding Bator alive. "All right," he finally said, "but I will go with you." Aldara, hearing their conversation, rushed to Helen. Fear was in her eyes, but also desperate hope. She grabbed the girl's hands, pleadingly looking into her eyes. Helen gently pulled free and brought Aldara's hand to the she-wolf's snout, letting the animal memorize the mother's scent, linked to the child's scent. The she-wolf sniffed, snorted, then raised its head, looking at Helen as if to say, "I understand." They set off into the wilderness as a trio, Helen, Demir, and the she-wolf. The pups remained in the encampment, too excitable and unpredictable for such a mission. The other search parties went in different directions, calling out the boy's name. The she-wolf led them along a barely visible trail. Sometimes it stopped, sniffing, changing direction. Helen followed, carefully examining the tracks in the snow. Demir brought up the rear, rifle at the ready. Not so much for protection against animals, but for a possible encounter with poachers. After 2 hours of travel, they reached a narrow, ice-bound river. The she-wolf was noticeably nervous, circling and sniffing the air. Helen squatted down, examining the snow. Small footprints ended at the river. Had the boy walked on the ice? Demir pointed to the opposite bank. There, among the trees, dark silhouettes were visible. He pulled out binoculars and gazed intently. His face darkened. "People," he said, lowering the binoculars. "3 or 4. A camp. Hunters or poachers, I can't tell." Helen tensed. If strangers noticed a lone child, they could help him, but they could also harm him, or simply leave him to die in the wilderness, unwilling to get involved in problems. The she-wolf suddenly pricked up its ears and froze, looking upstream. Helen followed its gaze and noticed a small figure sitting on a fallen tree. It was Beta, alive, unharmed, just sitting and looking at the water, as if in a daze. The girl touched Demir's sleeve and gestured. The shaman squinted, then nodded. He had seen it too. They moved cautiously along the bank, trying not to make noise. The main thing now was not to scare the child and not to attract the attention of the people on the opposite bank. As they approached, Helen saw that the boy was shivering from the cold. His small face was blue, his lips chapped. She slowly walked towards him, trying to move smoothly, without sudden movements. Bator looked up. There was no fear in his eyes, only exhaustion and some detached surprise. He smiled weakly, recognizing Helen and Demir. Then his gaze fell on the she-wolf, and his eyes widened. Before the boy could be frightened, Helen quickly took off her jacket and wrapped it around him. She checked his hands and feet to see if there was any frostbite. Fortunately, Bader's clothes were warm enough. He had only suffered mild hypothermia. Demir, meanwhile, looked around warily. He noticed something Helen didn't, and his face grew anxious. The shaman leaned towards the girl and pointed to the opposite bank. Then he made a gesture meaning, "Let's go." Helen nodded. She lifted Bator into her arms. The boy was light, exhausted by cold and fear. They began to retreat into the forest, trying to stay among the trees so they wouldn't be seen from the other bank. But it was too late. A sharp shout rent the silence. Helen didn't hear it, but she saw Demir flinch and the she-wolf flatten its ears and bare its teeth. They had been discovered. Demir grabbed Helen's hand and pulled her into the thicket. They ran between the trees, sinking into the snow. Bator, pressed against the girl's chest, didn't cry, as if understanding the danger and the need for silence. The she-wolf raced ahead, clearing a path. Helen glanced over her shoulder and saw movement on the opposite bank. People hastily breaking camp. One of them pointed in their direction. Another pulled something from a backpack. A rifle? At that thought, her blood ran cold. They plunged deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker. Demir stopped, breathing heavily. His face, usually calm, now showed alarm. He turned to Helen and slowly said, "These aren't just poachers. I saw their weapons and gear, military, maybe former, and they're looking for something in our forests." Helen hugged the child tighter. Bader trembled, but not from cold, from fear. He whispered something, looking at the shaman. Demir bent down to the boy, listened, and stood up with a pale face. "Bator says they were watching the encampment. They have maps and some kind of equipment. One of them talked about a mark on Bullhorn Mountain." Helen frowned. Bullhorn Mountain, a sacred mountain for the people where, according to legend, was a door to the spirit world. What could armed people be interested in such a place? Suddenly, the she-wolf tensed, the fur on its hackles rising. It growled softly, looking towards the river. Animals sense danger before people do. Demir pointed to a barely visible animal trail leading deeper into the wilderness. "We need to leave. This path will lead us to the encampment from the other side, longer but safer." They hurried along the trail. The snow here was shallow. The tree branches held back most of it. Helen carried Bader, who wrapped his small arms around her neck. Demir walked behind, constantly looking back. About an hour passed. The forest grew thicker, the trail barely discernible. The she-wolf confidently led them, occasionally stopping and sniffing, as if confirming the direction. Suddenly, the animal froze, hunkering low to the ground. Demir signaled them to stop. Ahead, between the trees, a shadow flickered, then another. These were not animals. They moved like humans, purposefully. The shaman cursed silently. They had been outflanked. The strangers knew the wilderness better than he had imagined, and now they had cut off the path to the encampment. Demir leaned against a tree, frantically considering the situation. Then he leaned towards Helen and said clearly, "I will distract them. You, with Bator and the she-wolf, go through Witch's Gorge." Helen shook her head in horror. Witch's Gorge was considered a cursed place. a narrow passage between cliffs where, according to belief, evil spirits dwelled. Even experienced hunters avoided it. Demir took her by the shoulders. "There is no other way. The she-wolf will guide you. The spirits will not touch one who speaks with wolves." He pulled a small bundle from inside his tunic and placed it in the girl's hand. "This is my daughter's amulet. It will protect you." The bundle contained the same bell the shaman had shown her. Helen clutched it in her palm, feeling the cold metal. Then she nodded, making her decision. Demir smiled at her, for the first time so openly and warmly. Then he turned and moved in the direction where the people had been spotted, deliberately making noise to attract attention. Helen, holding Beta close, followed the she-wolf in the opposite direction. They moved cautiously, trying not to leave tracks. The girl could feel the child's heart beating rapidly. Half an hour later, they reached the foot of a rocky slope. Ahead, a narrow passage was visible. Witch's Gorge. Even at twilight, it looked ominous. Sheer walls, almost closing in at the top, creating the impression of entering a stone maw. Helen hesitated. What if the legends were true? What if something supernatural really dwelled in the gorge? But there was no other way, and turning back meant facing their pursuers. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. The she-wolf walked beside her, pressing against her leg as if encouraging her. Betor whimpered softly, burying his face in her shoulder. The gorge turned out to be longer than it looked from the outside. The path wound between piles of stones, sometimes narrowing so much that they had to squeeze through sideways. The twilight deepened, transforming the stone figures around them into fantastic shapes. Helen walked on, without stopping. The bell, tied to her belt, must have jingled with each step, but she didn't hear the sound, only felt the slight movement of the metal. Suddenly, the she-wolf paused, the fur on its hackles standing on end. It looked ahead, growling softly. Helen tensed, peering into the gloom. On the path, blocking their way, stood an enormous grizzly bear. In January, when all bears should be hibernating, it stood on its hind legs, towering over them like a living mountain. Helen's heart stopped. Against a grizzly, they had no chance. The she-wolf, though large, looked like a pup next to it. Running back was pointless. The beast would catch them in seconds. And then something incredible happened. The grizzly dropped to all fours and moved aside, clearing the path. It looked at Helen with an almost intelligent gaze, as if recognizing her. The girl couldn't believe her eyes. She slowly walked forward, holding Beta close, who squeezed shut his eyes in fear and missed this miracle. The she-wolf followed her, not taking its eyes off the bear. As they passed, the beast turned its head, watching them. Helen could have sworn there was more than just animal curiosity in its eyes, something more, understanding, perhaps even empathy. After passing the bear, they quickened their pace. The gorge gradually widened, and ahead a faint light glimmered, the exit. They almost ran the last 100 yards and burst into an open space. A valley spread before them, and below, half a mile away, the encampment was visible. The campfires flickered in the deepening twilight, smoke rising above the tents. Helen exhaled in relief. They had done it. They had traversed Witch's Gorge, avoided encountering the poachers. Bator would be returned to his mother, and perhaps Demir had also managed to escape pursuit. But as they descended to the encampment, the girl couldn't shake a strange feeling. The bear in the gorge, its almost human gaze. Coincidence or the intervention of those very spirits the native people believed in so strongly. They were spotted as they approached. People ran out to meet them with shouts of joy. Aldara rushed towards them, reaching out for her son. Bator, seeing his mother, burst into tears, releasing all the fear he had held back during their escape. Helen handed the boy to his mother and looked around, searching for Demir, but the shaman was nowhere to be seen. Concerned, she pointed to the forest, asking with gestures if he had returned. Ursula shook her head. Demir hasn't returned, but the hunters went after him as soon as we noticed your absence. Helen felt a pang of anxiety. Had something happened to the shaman? What if he fell into the hands of those strange people? But then shouts erupted. From the forest, a group of men approached the encampment. In the center, supported on both sides, walked Demir. He was alive, though he looked exhausted. Helen sighed with relief. The shaman, seeing her and Bator, smiled. His plan had worked. They were safe. But the smile quickly vanished from his face as he approached and spoke. Those people are looking for something on our lands, something valuable and dangerous, and they won't stop until they find it. The encampment fell into an uneasy silence. The danger had passed, but only temporarily. The enemy had retreated, but not gone away, and the most terrible trial still lay ahead. The encampment prepared for defense. The men reinforced the caribou corrals, the women gathered essential supplies, and the children fell silent, sensing the adults' anxiety. Helen helped Ursula dry meat. In case of danger, they might have to retreat deeper into the wilderness. 3 days had passed since she and Batter returned from Witch's Gorge. Demir had gone out scouting with the hunters several times, and each time he returned with unsettling news. The strangers hadn't left. They had set up camp at the foot of Bullhorn Mountain and were searching for something using strange devices. In the evening, Demir gathered everyone around the large bonfire in the center of the encampment. His face was grim as he spoke. These people are searching for uranium deposits. The elders told us that during the Soviet era, geological surveys were conducted here, but then everything was abandoned. Now someone has decided to resume the search. If they find what they're looking for, our lands will no longer be ours. Sacred places will be desecrated, and the wilderness will die. People exchanged anxious glances. Many of them were young enough to understand that times had changed, and the right to land was now determined not by ancient traditions, but by papers in distant offices. I contacted representatives of the Indigenous Peoples Association, Demir continued. They promised to help, but it takes time, and we don't have time. The strangers are armed and dangerous. They will stop at nothing. Helen listened, observing the faces of the gathered. Fear, confusion, anger, emotions shifted between them. She felt strangely detached, as if observing from afar. This was not her people, not her land, but in a short time the encampment had become her home, and these people, her family. Suddenly, she stood up. All eyes turned to her. The girl approached Demir and gestured for birch bark and charcoal. When he gave her what she asked for, she quickly sketched a map of the area, marking the encampment, Witch's Gorge, and Bullhorn Mountain. Then she drew a line connecting all 3 points. Demir peered at the drawing, his brows furrowed. "You're suggesting we go through the gorge to the mountain, but there we'll encounter them directly." Helen shook her head. She drew a winding line, circling the mountain from the north, a route no one knew about. Then she pointed to the she-wolf sitting beside her. Demir understood. "The wolves know a path that isn't on maps?" The girl nodded. In recent days, she had often gone into the wilderness with the she-wolf. Exploring the surroundings, they had found an old trail hidden among rocks and thickets, perhaps an ancient path used by the ancestors of the native people and long forgotten. The shaman considered the proposal. It was a risk, but staying put was even more dangerous. If the strangers decided to come to the encampment, and they surely would, they would have no chance. "All right," he finally said. "We will leave tomorrow at dawn. We'll take only what's necessary and the caribou. The rest will have to be left behind." Pain was in his voice. For the native people, the encampment was not just a place to live. It was the center of their world, their connection to their ancestors. To leave it meant to sever that connection. No one slept that night. The women packed belongings, the men checked weapons and gear. The children were quiet, clinging to their mothers. Tension hung in the air, mixed with sadness. Helen sat by her tent, gazing at the stars. The she-wolf lay beside her, its head on her lap. The girl thought about how strangely her life had turned. A month ago, she was wandering through the wilderness, banished and alone, ready to die in the snows. Now the lives of an entire encampment depended on her. Demir approached quietly, almost silently. He sat beside her, looking in the same direction, at Bullhorn Mountain, silhouetted darkly against the starry sky. "When I was a boy," he said, "the old shaman told a legend about a woman who would come from the forest with wolves and save the people from great misfortune. I thought it was just a fairy tale. Now I'm not so sure." Helen looked at him in surprise. Demir smiled. "Don't be afraid of tomorrow. The spirits guide us, even if we don't see the way." Dawn broke gray and cold. The encampment became a hive of activity. People rushed to finish last-minute preparations. The caribou shuffled restlessly, sensing their owner's anxiety. Dogs barked, and wolves paced nervously around the perimeter. Helen stood by her tent, dressed in warm native clothing, a knife at her belt, a light backpack with essentials on her back. She was ready. Suddenly, shouts came from the forest. People froze, listening. Helen didn't hear the sounds, but she saw their faces tense. Demir ran forward, peering into the trees. A young hunter burst from the forest thicket, covered in blood, stumbling with exhaustion. He shouted something, pointing back. Demir turned pale. "They're coming," he translated for Helen. "Armed men, at least a dozen. They killed Eldridge when he tried to stop them." Panic gripped the encampment. Women grabbed children, men hastily finished packing. Only minutes remained until dawn, but they could no longer wait. Demir took command. He divided the people into groups. Some led the caribou, others carried provisions, still others supported the old and weak. Helen and the she-wolf went ahead, guiding the way. They moved as quickly as circumstances allowed. The trail wound between the trees, climbing higher toward the mountain ridges. Shouts were heard from behind. The strangers had discovered the empty encampment and were now pursuing the fugitives. The sun rose above the horizon as they reached a narrow pass between the cliffs. Beyond, the trail forked. One branch led down to the valley. The other led up to the inaccessible slopes of Bullhorn Mountain. Helen stopped, looking back. The people were exhausted, especially the women with children and the elders. The pursuers, judging by the shouts, were inexorably approaching. Suddenly, a plan coalesced in her mind. She called Demir over and quickly sketched a diagram on the ground. The shaman understood instantly. You want to split up? The elders, children, and women will go down to the valley, and we and the hunters will hold off the pursuers on the mountain trail? Helen nodded. It was the only chance. Damir hesitated for only a moment, then began to give orders. Most of the encampment, led by Ercole, moved along the lower trail. Damir, Helen, and a dozen hunters remained, preparing to meet the enemy. The she-wolf circled restlessly nearby. Helen stroked its head, as if saying goodbye. Then she lifted her head, listening to her senses. She heard no sounds, but felt the vibration of the ground beneath her feet. The pursuers were already close. Damir stood beside her, gripping an ancient spear. His face was calm, but his eyes showed the determination of a man ready to die for his people. The first of the pursuers appeared from around a bend in the trail, a tall man in camouflage with a rifle at the ready. Others followed him, all armed, all with predatory, cruel faces. The man stopped, seeing the small group of natives blocking their way. He shouted something, his voice mocking. Damir straightened, answering him with dignity. Helen didn't hear the words, but she felt the tension hanging in the air. And then something unexpected happened. From the forest surrounding the trail came wolves, not only the she-wolf and her grown children, but other wild wolves of the wilderness. They surrounded the natives in a semicircle, looking at the strangers with obvious menace. The poachers froze. One raised his rifle, aiming at the nearest wolf, but Helen stepped forward, standing between him and the animal. She looked directly into the leader's eyes, not blinking, not averting her gaze, and then she did something she had never done in her life. She opened her mouth and screamed, not silently as before, but letting out a real sound. It wasn't a word or even an articulate sound, just a primal cry coming from the deepest depths of her soul. She didn't hear her own voice, but she felt it, a vibration in her throat, in her chest, in her very heart. And she saw Damir's eyes widen, the strangers flinch, the wolves grow wary. The echo resonated through the mountains, reflecting off the cliffs, intensifying and returning. And at that moment, Bullhorn Mountain seemed to come alive. Stones trembled, snow on the peak began to move. An avalanche began. A huge mass of snow and ice crashed down, blocking the trail between the natives and the pursuers. The strangers panicked and scrambled back, but for many it was too late. The avalanche caught them, burying them under a thick layer of snow. Helen stood, disbelieving her eyes. Her scream, the first in her life, had caused an avalanche that saved the encampment from destruction. Damir looked at her with a mix of fear and reverence. "You truly are the one spoken of in legend," he whispered, "the woman whose voice will save the people." Helen shook her head. She was not chosen or a messenger of spirits, just a girl who found the strength to scream when it was necessary. They descended into the valley where the others waited. Ercole rushed to them, hugging and weeping with joy. News of the miraculous rescue had already spread among the people. That evening, by the fire, Damir told the story of a girl banished from her home, saved by wolves, and who became the savior of an entire people. Helen sat, embracing the she-wolf, and watched the flames. She didn't hear the shaman's words, but she felt their meaning in the eyes of the people who looked at her with gratitude and respect. Then Damir approached her and extended his hand. In his palm lay a small silver bell, the same one that had belonged to his daughter. "Now it is yours," the shaman said. "You have recovered a voice that was lost." Helen accepted the gift, clutching the cool metal in her palm. She still couldn't hear the chime, but she felt it with her whole being, like a heartbeat, like the breath of the wilderness, like a voice found in a moment of ultimate danger. That night she looked at the stars for a long time, thinking about the strange turns of fate, about the father who had driven her out into the frost, about the she-wolf who had saved her from death, about the people who had become her new family. She didn't know what lay ahead for them, but now she had a home. She had a family, and she had a voice. Even if she couldn't hear it, she could feel it, and that was enough. The she-wolf rested its head on her lap, looking with almost human understanding. Helen smiled, stroking its coarse fur. They had walked this path together, from the edge of death to a new life, and whatever happened next, they would face it together. The silence around her no longer seemed empty. It was filled with feelings, images, connections. And somewhere in that silence, the silver bell chimed, reminding her that even the quietest sound can change the world if it rings at the right moment. Thank you for watching. What do you think about this story? Share your impressions. Your comment is very valuable to us.